Yeah, and you've been covering this one for years. I mean, when did it come on your radar, this whole Epstein story?
I think I heard this first from a Ben Swan report on RT. I want to say maybe around 2016, and then his name eventually got tied to the 4chan information coming out. That would be eventually Pizzazz Gate, whatever we can or can't say here, but you know what I'm talking about. That
Mhm.
morphed into the disinformation operation known as QChan, or excuse me, QTard stuff on 4chan, I should say. And so it was around that time that I first heard about him, and then Alex covered it pretty significantly for a good while in regard to the Lolita Express, which was the first, I think, big mainstream news story that broke with high profile people, celebrities, academics, CEOs flying on the planes and reportedly being compromised, in the Mile High Club. So that was what everybody kind of thought it was originally. And then it was a lot of Clinton information and it was kind of connected adjacent to WikiLeaks back in 2016, 17, 18. So that was my first exposure to it.
Yeah, a long time. Watson was the first person I ever saw cover that. I think he did a video way back, even before maybe Epstein was even arrested, like talking about Epstein Island. So yeah, a few people were onto this early days. But yeah, guys, so we're going to be going through all of that, the history of it, who is Jeffrey Epstein, and then some of the more nefarious things. We're going to get into the banking, the Rothschilds connection, the connection with old school money Rothschilds, and then new tech. We're going to get into his obsession with eugenics and Peter Nygaard, and the use of what would you call it? The use of blood plasma,
Aborted
the
stem cells and
aborted
and
stem
yeah,
cells
yeah.
to for the fountain of youth. It's all, and then we're going to get into the theory of is could Jeffrey still be alive? So it should be an entertaining one today, guys. If you do want to leave a super chat, we will read them out in intervals between topics. Leave Jay a question, whatever you want to ask him. If you go on Stream Elements, which should be pinned in the comments in the chat there, then YouTube doesn't take any chats. And if it's anything over 100, then it is TTS. So it will just pop up on screen and it will be an immediate question read. So I guess, Jay, just, and by the way, guys, like the video on the way in if you could. Just smash that like button. Helps us out enormously if you do that, because it is a touchy subject on YouTube and they do tend to put this one on the back burner. So, Jay, let's start off with just who is Jeffrey Epstein, because I think one of the things that these files have actually elucidated for people is that Jeffrey Epstein is not some little guy who was a pawn. And even I thought that for a little while. Maybe he was just some guy who's been used as a pawn. He's not very powerful himself, and he's maybe a fall guy, and there are much bigger people than him. But for those wondering, who exactly is he, and what role does he play in this whole entire international trafficking, espionage, blackmail organization?
I think the best description is that he's kind of like a Bond villain, but not at the top of the pyramid. So he's kind of a mid-level fixer consultant, and my estimation would be an organized crime PhD. There are actually people in the world of organized crime and cartels and whatnot who do specialize in the ability to network and finance and organize things. For example, one thing that helps to understand Epstein is to understand the world of the mafia and organized crime. And I've done a lot of research in that subject over the years. And on my stream right before this, we were covering an interview with Meyer Lansky. And a lot of people don't know that the famous gangster Meyer Lansky was actually organizing and helping Lucky Luciano to set up the structure of the Sicilian mafia in America. So it's actually the Tony Sopranos that would kind of go to people like Sidney Korshak and Meyer Lansky to get the overall structure, the connections, the networking. In fact, even Murder Inc., the famous guild of assassins, was originally part of the Jewish mafia and then sort of combined with the Sicilian mafia. So if we understand the way that those kinds of criminal networks work, it's very insightful, I think, into understanding Epstein's international criminal network. It has a very interlinked, powerful global structure that maybe a lot of mafias only have in a region. So I think expand Meyer Lansky internationally, and you really understand Epstein. But I think you're right that he's not the top of the pyramid. There's certainly people that seem to be in many emails giving him orders, giving him permission to assassinate people, etc. But he was very powerful because the second day, some of the messages and emails that came out included an organizing, like a planning, a day planner that had him meeting about 15 heads of state throughout
Mm.
the entire world 15 different countries. And you're not doing that unless you have a lot of power. We have him 1 month before Zelensky comes to power. He's in Ukraine. He flies over there after emails with Arena Rothschild saying we can profit from this chaos and destabilization. We're able to go in and buy it up. We see him asking actually Zelensky asking to get the attention of Epstein for consultation, advice, and purposes. So he seems to be kind of like a fixer, consultant, international Blofeld figure, but he's not at the top of the pyramid. Certainly, there's people above him and people that have way more wealth than him, but he's definitely liaisoning and being a legate of the Rothschilds and perhaps Israel at various degrees. He's consulting Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, on how to get Peter Thiel into the web to get him on their side, as well as other companies, corporations. And so it's pretty much all of the worst stuff that you could think of, but it's all now verified. But it's not new. This is something that people should understand that I've really been hammering home this week. Is we've covered historical texts that deal with the history of blackmail, honey traps, sexpionage. That's always gone on. It's just that I think nowadays with tech and sophistication in terms of globalization, it's a lot more integrated and a lot more scientific, believe it or not, in terms of how they do even organized crime in these operations. So it's all of that.
Yeah, who do you think sort of sits above him then? If you're saying that he's like taking orders from people, is it people like Leslie Wexner, or is it the governments and the intelligence agencies that he's working for?
Great question. In the case of Maxwell, I think is a really important person to look to, Robert, I'm saying, because Robert Maxwell was the front for the Rothschilds back during the Cold War, or at least one of the fronts. He was part of a publishing empire with Maxwell Publishing and Pergamon Press. In fact, they actually published that global elite text, Changing Images of Man, that we covered a few weeks ago on Alex Jones. It got a lot of traction. That was published by Epstein, by Maxwell. But Maxwell was part of a cutout of an empire of billions of dollars of publishing, but he was also really working for British intelligence
Mm.
initially, everybody thought, and he was brought into that and sort of coached by Victor Rothschild. And Victor Rothschild was famously British intelligence, but a lot of people, even years ago, were writing books in terms of the espionage world, speculating that in the Cambridge spy ring case, where there's this suspicious, mysterious missing person of the Cambridge spy ring. And for those that don't know, during the Cold War, this is a bunch of British intelligence agents who famously flipped and defected to the Soviet Union. And by the way, most of them or all of them were actually gay. So they had a lot of intelligence agents who famously flipped and I'm hearing myself.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So long story short, the reason this matters is that those British intelligence operatives like Kim Philby and Guy Burgess and McLean and Blunt, they flipped and became Soviets and went to Russia because they'd actually been blackmailed by unknown Soviets and intelligence operatives. But people have speculated that that person doing the blackmail might have actually been Lord Rothschild this whole time. We don't know for sure, but it seems like it. And another indicator that might be the case is that the person who really coached and trained Ghislaine and Robert was perhaps Rothschild himself, Lord Victor Rothschild out of the UK. So if that's the case, then now we can understand that this is an older operation that's just sort of copied and pasted for the next generation. And so Ghislaine and Robert, or excuse me, Ghislaine and Epstein sort of take that over. And so they bring Epstein in, right? So he's not part
Mm.
of any blue blood family. They bring that up in the Bannon interview. He says he's just a regular Jewish guy, but he's recruited him because he seems to have certain talents and abilities. It's still debated how mathematical and scientifically a savant he really was. I get a lot of indications of being a sued from that Bannon interview, that he wasn't actually as intelligent as he comes off, but he is really skilled at networking, consulting, and crime. And there are actual people that have the equivalent of like PhDs in criminal organizations, believe it or not. So I would say that's what he is. And when you look at Maxwell and the background, it's a copy paste operation that suggests foreign heads of state, Rothschilds, and other, I would say, would be especially Mossad, for example. I know we're not going to focus on that, but that's relevant because of Maxwell again, because there was that very, very insightful email from Jeffrey that he's explaining the reason that Robert Maxwell was assassinated was that while he was working for British intelligence and the Mossad, he was also selling secrets and giving information to the Soviets. So he's playing both sides of the Cold War, something that I've
Mm.
highlighted for a long time with people like Armand Hammer and people like Lord Victor Rothschild playing both sides. Well, Maxwell apparently tried to do that, and he tried to extort the Mossad for 400 million pounds. And so he had appointed himself as the attaché, without being asked to do so, apparently, for Israel to the Soviet Union, and Israel resented that. So I think
And
that
then
played
he
a key
found
role.
himself in the water.
Exactly.
And he
He
found
found himself in
himself
the water.
falling off the boat accidentally. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
I think that those are indicators of people who, people in that higher billionaire, multi-billion dollar class. I think we're definitely above Epstein. Nobody really knows how much money he had. Definitely Leslie Wexner plays a key role in probably being above Epstein in these kinds of operations. And also remember, Epstein was brought in originally through Bill Barr of the OSS. And so this is an OSS CIA kind of early stage recruiting, bringing in, grooming process, but he also liaisons and works with other intelligence agencies too. As Whitney Webb points out, he has multiple passports, which again indicates most likely some sort of intelligence pedigree. And now that the emails have come out, I think that's 100% confirmed.
So, what do you think it is about these new emails that really specifically point to intelligence? Because before this, we had lots of associations with government figures. For example, you had Ehud Barak and his very close relationship with him. You've obviously got Robert Maxwell, who you mentioned before, Ghislaine obviously being his daughter. What is it about these emails that really sort of highlight that?
There's a lot. First thing I would say is, in terms of the background, being brought into these, certain schools and certain private academies and whatnot, being groomed to then be put into Wall Street. One odd indicator is the fact that when he went to Bear Stearns and was involved in insider trading, his partner Hoffman or Hofstad or whatever it is, that guy went to jail, but Epstein did not get any trouble. So I think
Mm,
that's a little
yeah.
suspicious. Maybe there was some deal cut, something like that. A lot of people have called attention to that, and then it's sort of immediately he's brought into just a scale of operations and connections that just really don't make sense with the background that he originally had, and then they seem to have concocted a legend. And in the spy world, people that have a shady background or a made up background. It's called a legend, which gives you the story of, oh, I'm a money manager, a hedge funds, I handle billions of dollars. And that may or may not be true, right? So, but it might be part of your background cover or story. And then he's immediately connected in the circles of famous weapons traffickers like Adnan Khashoggi. And this little side note, Khashoggi's yacht was also set up with surveillance equipment. Was involved in a famous case of bringing in underage, I think, Pakistani prostitutes back in the 80s or 90s. Whitney Webb highlights that in the first couple chapters. But so those connections and associations right away, having multiple passports right away. When Acosta, the lawyer from from Florida, was involved in this case, he was originally told when he was looking into this, let Epstein go, he's intelligence. So we already had a lot of these
Mm,
indicators coming out. And then we have Ari Ben Menashe, who was a former Mossad operative, telling many news outlets over the last several years that obviously, of course, Epstein was Mossad. So you've got a lot of testimonies, a lot of evidences, but I think now that the emails and the files have come out, we have everything from Epstein giving money to the IDF, Epstein essentially directly working many times. Even mainstream media reported that Ehud Barak visited his mansion dozens of times, 16, maybe something like that, in New York. Very close associations working with Ehud Barak. We've all heard this phone call, I think, now about how to get Peter Thiel involved. I mean, everything about this just totally, I think, screams, that. There's the Bannon exchanges where he says all roads lead not to China but to Tel Aviv. Um, I mean, you can just keep going on and on. And it also, again, bears all the similarities and patterns of the Maxwell operation. And little side note, my buddy Mark Hackard, he's an analyst of espionage history and whatnot, a translator, and he translated a KGB colonel's Cold War era assessment of Maxwell. And he put this up maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it was a really fascinating take to see the Soviets' attitude from their generals and colonels as to what they understood Maxwell to be. And they pictured him as a person trying to play both sides of the Cold War,
right.
and that they thought he was selling secrets to the Soviets as he was trying to blackmail Western intelligence and the Mossad, and that's exactly what happened. So, ironically, the Soviet account of Maxwell seems to have been vindicated and correct here as well, and that's according to Jeffrey's testament, which perhaps just Jeffrey was lying or he didn't know, but that seems to make the most sense. And again, that indicates, I think, high level Israeli operation to a degree, but also CIA as well. We shouldn't leave that out because I think, as Mike Benz showed in several emails, Epstein was using, former CIA planes, flying them for many decades without any problem. He also seemed to have Department of Justice or State Department. I forget. Whitney Webb has a chapter on this. He stayed at a place, an apartment owned by that was a Department of State like property. Why was he
Mm.
allowed to stay at the property and to do things seemingly at an international state level, even after being, a known criminal? So I think a lot of that above the law stuff also suggests intelligence capabilities. And again, you can, with the relationship of Western intelligence through the Five Eyes and this kind of stuff, like you can be multiple, you can work for multiple agencies, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, one thing I did notice about his interviews post arrest was that he always seemed very unconcerned with things. And then after 2009, it's just pretty much business as usual. I mean, he's charged in 2009, he's put on the sex offenders list. And then after that, it really does seem like business as usual again. But one of the questions I always do have is if he is an intelligence agent of some sort, and if he does have these deep entrenched ties with US and Israeli intelligence, and if he's a protected man or a made man in that sense, why did he get arrested in the first place? Like, how could it possibly be allowed that he would even be highlighted if he's got all of these big intelligence connections? Why are we here?
Yeah. Also, I think British intelligence is an important angle too, because a lot of times they're overlooked because people think about only the CIA or they only think about Israeli intelligence. But British intelligence is a key player in this
Mm.
as well. In fact, British intelligence set up the American CIA, and of course, they had a role as well in helping to establish the Mossad as Israel was established out of a British colony. So all of these things are interlinked with the special relationship between the U.S. and British intelligence. And that was my grad work, by the way, was studying British intelligence stuff. So that's why I like to bring that in. And
Mm.
remember, Epstein very early on was going and hanging out with Princess Di. He's very close to several of the royals, especially Prince Andrew. So I think British intelligence is also important to understand in this relationship as well because they are a big player, but it's all three of those, Atlanticist, Five Eyes networks together. And I think the reason he got caught is probably because something this big scale, this industrial in terms of its just scope and so many years, there's going to be a lot of victims. And at some point, some people are going to come forward. I think that's really what originally sort of began to undo the sweater, to quote Weezer.
Mm.
When the sweater's undone, you keep pulling and pulling and pulling. Eventually, it's like you can't just kill everybody and cover everything up. So it's kind of like Nexium. Nexium had a very similar kind of elite billionaire Bronfman style structure that eventually so many people were wrapped up in this that when you start having the daughters of elite families even being offered up to Epstein, which I thought was pretty wild. I wouldn't have
Yeah.
expected the royalty of the UK and EU to be so sort of flippant with give me parenting advice for my
Yeah.
child, and here's my daughter Sophia, here's our daughter of Bulgaria or whatever, just trying to or Denmark or whatever. That was pretty surprising, but I think eventually that industrial scale stuff, it just there's so many people involved that it's too difficult to not have whistleblowers and women coming forward. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the banking connection here. It appears as though Epstein was talking a lot about banking in the interview that he did with Bannon, for example. He's talking about fractional reserve banking, and if only people understood how this actually works. He has this connection with the Rothschilds. In one email where he's speaking to Peter Thiel, he's saying that
Mhm.
I represent the Rothschilds. Now, that could be interpreted multiple ways. First of all, the way I would interpret it is that he's obviously manages assets. So he manages
Mhm.
assets of the Rothschilds. And he's trying to speak to Peter Thiel in a way that Peter Thiel doesn't need money, but he would need access. So he's maybe saying, I represent the Rothschilds. I'll give you access to all of this old money. All of this old money is trying to find a way into new money, into tech. How did you interpret that, particularly the relationship with the Rothschilds?
Yeah, I think combined with the other emails that he's having with Ariana de Rothschild and other statements about the $25 million contract he had with the Rothschilds, you have an older family, as you said, that is running things even 200, 300 years ago on the basis of advanced intelligence. And I think a lot of people don't think about intelligence and espionage in the modern world actually coming out of banking and academia. They think about it like it's James Bond, it's spies, it's going around fucking bitches. No, it's not mainly that. It's a little bit of that, but it's mainly high finance and understanding human nature and compromising people. That's a huge part of what it is. It's also media and disinformation, sure, but uh, as Epstein explains early on in the Bannon interview, he was recruited, spotted, ironically, by the same people that spotted and recruited Brzezinski. And in the case of the Trilateral Commission, this is a higher level commission, kind of out of the Council on Foreign Relations that the Rockefeller set up in the 1920s. The Trilateral was set up specifically by Kissinger for Brzezinski to run in the 1970s because Brzezinski was so impressed with Kissinger was so impressed with Brzezinski's book Between Two Ages and how well he understood the technocratic era. So they created the steering committee for him to be on, and that's ironically what Epstein says he was recruited into and put in the steering committee of Trilateral in 1990 because the Kissinger family and David Rockefeller himself really were impressed with, according to Epstein, his ability to understand high finance and to explain it to them. That's a very key thing there. And so knowing the fractional reserve banking aspect, which is basically just banks lending out more than they have on reserves. And if you read Carol Quigley's Strategy and Hope, he basically admits as a CFR apologist that Western banking for several hundred years has been based on that sort of Rothschild model. That's what the Federal Reserve is based on, is the idea of putting out more gold notes than you actually have gold in the reserves. So that's why it's a fractional reserve. You only need a fraction of the reserves to match what you're putting out. So you can
Mm.
lend out sometimes even 10, 20 times what you have on reserve. And then you charge interest on these loans. And then you can buy real assets and real wealth, gold, et cetera. So that's kind of the scam that ironically Quigley talks about
So just
even within
quickly, how does if he's an apologist for this, how does he if you had to steel man his point for why that's a good thing, fractional reserve
the
banking, how would you do that?
Well, Quigley's book, he's a military historian, so he's not primarily interested in banking, but he just thinks, I think that an international democrat, the way he describes it at the end of the book as an apologist, he says an international capitalist democratic order is for him the greatest hope in response to a century of two world wars and a Cold War. So he thinks the tragedy of the century is the wars. The hope is democratic capitalism. I know that sounds kind of fake and gay, but he wrote that in the 1960s, and so that is what he says at the end of the book. He's like, I don't have to steelman it because that's what he says. He says, look, yeah, I'm an apologist for this system. He even says that in the book. He says, I was permitted access to the CFR archives, and I am defending the position because I think this is the best hope for the modern world. It's not going to be with a traditionalist Russia, he says, and it's not going to be with a traditional Catholic Axis power like Austro-Hungarian Empire or something like that. The future will be something akin to a international democratic capitalist order. So that's what he thinks, or that's what he says at least. But and of course, he was Bill Clinton's mentor, and again, a high level CFR historian and archivist. And what I'm getting at is that that's ironic because I didn't actually expect Epstein to have been recruited into the Trilateral Commission. I would have thought he was more of a, just doing more organized crime type stuff. But
Mm.
apparently, he was definitely higher up than most people expected, and that would put him kind of, again, not. I wouldn't say he's like. I mean, Brzezinski is definitely a very intelligent person who's an open technocrat. He's telling the CIA what to do under Carter. He's basically creating the Mujahideen and Al Qaeda. That's literally what Brzezinski's known for. So I don't think he was as high tier as that in terms of power structure, but he's like a Brzezinski or a Kissinger to some degree because he's on their steering committees.
Right. Okay. All right. So his relationship with the Rothschilds, let's just first of all actually go back in history a little bit and understand why it's important. Because I think everybody's maybe watched a few videos about the Rothschilds and the international banking syndicate that they sort of run and how they came from a family, right, where the father gave an inheritance to the kids, or he said the kids around the world, and they all made banks in various different countries, and then all sort of worked together. And they've been very much involved. Were they involved in the French Revolution? They were definitely involved in the creation of the State of Israel and the
Oh,
World War
yeah.
One and Two funding.
That's a great question. I mean, Quigley has a whole chapter on the funding of the French Revolution, and he says Jewish and Swiss banks that were Protestant, but he doesn't say which. However, out of the French Revolution, the Rothschilds did become the primary members of the French central bank.
Mm,
So this becomes what's called the Paribas banking system. So Paribas is the Rothschild banking network and system. So you're absolutely correct that the original forefather sent his sons out throughout Europe and said, "Go set it up," in these different countries. And ironically, that according to some authors on this topic, that appears to be the same model that they did in the U.S. as well. Because people, a lot of times, normie historians think, "Oh, well, there was no Rothschild presence in the United States, at least not until the modern era." But people have actually dug into this, and there's a lot of theory that J.P. Morgan and the early Morgan bankers of the 1800s were actually a front for the Rothschilds, and I think there is
mm.
significant evidence to suggest that. So I think,
Well, because the
yeah,
theory is
that's
that
the
they sort of
model.
died out over time, isn't it? That there was some conflict in the family, and then eventually the Rothschilds didn't have as much power. But you're saying that they actually had fronts for their family banking dynasty.
Well, the Paribas system lasted for a while. It didn't endure. But some people think that there's also shadow banking, and ironically, Epstein seems to mention this here and there. And that's an element to where, because a lot of these banks that are super secretive, there's things that we don't know even to this day. For example, one of the books that my publisher just put out about the Bank for National Settlements, which is one of these high tier post World War II. It's the sort of bank for central banks. Like, they have classified documents that no one has seen. In fact, there was just some declassified documents a few years ago that people went and researched about the BIS and learned about its relationship to the Bank of England. So because there's shadow banking, and there's even classifications about international banking for many years, like, there's a lot of things that we don't know. So there could be hidden wealth, shadow wealth that we don't know about, and that's what leads a lot of people to say, "Oh, the Rothschilds never lost money." And but it's still, I mean, either way, it's possible that they did, lose some pedigree over time. But there was also some articles, maybe 8, 10 years ago, even in mainstream media, that the American Rothschild banking empire, or excuse me, the American Rockefeller banking empire had joined forces with the Rothschild banking empire. So even if they did lose some pedigree, I mean, they're still very important, still very powerful, and they still apparently have no problem, openly engaging in the same types of activities that Epstein was involved in, and networking with him. And so, in other words, we don't really know, but we can look at some indicators of possibilities.
Right. So then moving forward here, do you think that Epstein's relationship with the Rothschilds was more just managing assets, or do you think that it's more of a relationship of them pulling the levers of what he's doing and him working for them?
I think it's the latter, because again, going back to, for example, like I said earlier, the origins of modern intelligence, like, um, when they have that famous story about Nathan Rothschild, or excuse me, about the Rothschild situation in the UK when he had advanced intelligence on Waterloo. They brag about that in pages 48, 49 of the book, the Morton authorized biography, that, yeah, this is a true story. We used intel to know ahead of time how to trade and to buy up when the stock market crashed, so forth. So that's essentially what we see. Fast forward 200 years later, and you've got, these emails between him and Ariana talking about the exact same strategy, the exact same model. So I think that he that's again, like, you don't have to be trained by the CIA at Langley to be, like, doing these kinds of operations and networking for intelligence. I mean, you could be an asset, you could be just a, in Israeli intelligence, they have the idea of the Katsa, or the Cyanim. These are also possibilities as well. You don't have to be, James Bond to be doing this kind of stuff. And there's also corporate espionage, there's private espionage, those things exist too. So the Rothschild model is apparently, banking and intelligence is their connection. Interpol, if I recall, I think comes out of Rothschild intelligence networking. And many media outlets. Was it AP or is it The Economist is a Rothschild magazine? And then
Right.
one of the big out, I think it was AP, or if it's United Press or one of those is also has its origins in the Rothschild networks. But so they really figured this out for banking, that having an intelligence network is the way to really do it. And by the way, David Rockefeller has a chapter in his memoirs where he says, I learned in my intelligence time in the military how to set up the networks and the structuring for my banking empire. So they
Mm.
take the intelligence civil service and they translate it into the private sphere. By the way, that's exactly what Epstein consults Ehud Barak on. He says, I'm going to teach you how to go from civil service, public service, into taking that information, that knowledge, and putting it into private intelligence and private service and becoming a consultant. You can consult, he says, for millions of dollars a year just consulting people. So, long story short, yeah, I think it is more so the latter. And again, it's difficult to know because so much of banking is kind of private and proprietary and secretive. And even the two biggest central secret banks in the world, like the Vatican Bank or the Bank for National Settlements, I mean, they're super secretive. But there's so much we don't even know about what they're up to, and they do that by design, right? That's the real secret society, is these international banking cliques,
Mm.
and that's why they can fund both sides of conflicts. They need to be international and above nation state purview. And if you're going to fund criminal operations or black ops or whatever, like, you don't want congressional oversight. You don't want inquiries into that money. You need these kind of super secretive banks. And the way Epstein even describes, this surprised me. He was describing how the Vatican Bank works to Larry Summers, who is a Clinton era banking vulture. You would think that a guy coming out of Harvard would know how the Vatican Bank works, but apparently Epstein had to explain to him that this is the greatest secret bank. It's perfect for money laundering and funneling things to black ops. It's because it's super secret, and the BIS is the same way.
Right. So we mentioned before about the email with him and Teal. And then I think off stream you told me that this is like reminiscent, or as Candace Owens would say, reminiscent of the way in which the Rothschilds have done things over the last few hundred
That's when
years.
you are all remembering, right? If you're
Yeah.
reminiscent, you can remember all things. Like, it's
Yes. Yeah.
omniscient. I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yeah.
But listen, Jake, don't be too macabre. Okay, so a lot of these
No, no,
topics are
no.
dark.
These are
They're
these
very
are
much macabre.
these are macabre topics, dude. So how does that link up if you're looking at the way in which the Rothschilds have done things over the past few hundred years, and then the sort of maneuvering that Epstein's doing there to try and get into the new money tech world?
Yeah, great point. Because as we said, say with Waterloo, or the way that Quigley's chapter on French banking and the Paribas system describes it, is that it's intimately connected to intelligence. And if you want a more modern, updated version of this, which perfectly applies to Epstein, watch Oliver Stone's movie Wall Street, because you have the Charlie Sheen character Bud Fox, who goes to Wall Street. He's from a middle class working family. He wants to make it big. He wants to get out of the small town. He's going to be a multimillionaire, and he thinks if he can be like Gordon Gekko, the Michael Douglas Viper trader character, he can get out of it. And what he learns is very perceptive for Stone to put this in the film. What he learns is that everything that Michael Douglas is teaching him is the opposite of what he thought that world was. He thought if you just worked hard, paid attention to the data, made the calls, watched your computer screens, whatever, that you would be a great trader. And
Mm,
actually, Gordon Gekko says, "You idiot. It's about insider knowledge and advanced knowledge. That's how you make your money. You get dirt on people. You do
mm,
that. That's the way to the top." And it sort of blows the mind of, Bud Fox, because it requires him eventually to turn on his own family and their business. So Wall Street's good to see that, and that's really the model. I think that the Rothschild figured out a long time ago, is that do you want to get ahead of the game? You want to know where to put money. Epstein has a couple of emails joking about that, where he's like, "Yeah, we short trade certain stocks, and we leave that to the goyim,
mm.
and they can deal with the real." He says they can deal with the real world. We have the insider world. That was a very insightful email there, because that's exactly what we're talking about. So banking is more close to intelligence than the James Bond stuff, although there's a lower level of that kind of stuff going
So
on.
just
But
quickly,
yeah,
just
that's
so
what.
that when he's talking about the insider stuff, can you just explain like what that means a little bit better? So they are doing all of the dirty work, and they're sort of like controlling and manipulating the market, if you will, and then other people like the goyim, they say, are like the ones who are invested in the stocks and buying and selling in certain points and everything. Is that what they're talking about?
Yeah, so for example, just coming off the top of my head, like if there's going to be a chaos or conflict in a region, that's going to disrupt obviously the economics of that region. So, for example, Ukraine, when the Ukraine conflict popped off, uh, it wasn't too long until I mean, the conflict popped off obviously with Maidan and all that, but by the time of Zelensky, if you remember, there was that clip where Zelensky was like, "Want to tell you, everybody in the West, to BlackRock, all of you companies, come to Ukraine, great to
Yes.
buy things."
Yeah.
Well, that's an example where in the Epstein emails, we get this impression that he's constantly sort of scanning to see where the next conflict zones might be so that they can get in ahead of the conflict and be ready to, buy things up, short the market, whatever it is, say based on the resources or the grain that comes out of that area or the one of the really insightful emails on this was the Somali email. That was crazy because way before we had all these migrants in the West, Epstein seems to have been aware of a coming Somalia, destabilization chaos operation where he says we can get in there, get in early, grab the resources. Another insight into this is Hillary's letter, or she wrote an essay for the Brookings Institute, which is a big high level think tank. This was back when everybody was talking about Hillary's pay to play scandal, that you had these world leaders, Saudis, and others were putting money into Hillary's campaign as a pay to play scam, where when she went into some country like Libya, and then they divide up the gold, then the people who donated to her campaign would get their cut, basically. So that's another angle of it. Yeah, I mean, look up Hillary's little paper she wrote for Brookings, and then it came out same thing in the WikiLeaks Hillary's emails, and there's an Epstein email basically confirming the same thing about Libya, that when we go in, we can get Gaddafi's gold. He has, I forget what they said, $2 billion worth of gold stashed up. We'll use the US. So they basically use the US government, the stupidity of the American public and patriotism to get them on board with these foreign ventures that are actually about, uh, gaining the land and the resources and the precious, rare earth minerals in these regions.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I'm super interested in, I don't know, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on in terms of this whole Rothschild's connection and the old money, new money thing? Because soon I want to move on to this eugenics program. But anything else you've got in regards to this?
Well,
This
it's interesting that in regard to the connection that not many people have called attention to, other than myself, is the
mm,
Vatican Bank that
right? Okay. Yeah.
That Epstein seemed to know so much about, and his close connection with John Paul II. Not just, by the way, allegedly staying in the Vatican for a period of time, and then consulting John Paul on various architectural features, which we know Epstein was very into tile and architecture for whatever reason, and structural compounds that have tunnels, by the way. Um,
Mm,
but he also says in another email that he had been gifted some ceiling piece from John Paul II. We know he was at a John Paul II audience where he and Ghislaine received a blessing. So I think there's significant connections there that do make a clear close relationship with John Paul II. Now, I'm not saying that we know that John Paul was involved in anything per se, but that there was this close relationship, I think, is verifiable. And the people running point to sort of disarm this argument are full of it. Most of the arguments are totally bull crap. But the reason I bring that up is that it's not accidental that he has a deep insight into the workings of the Vatican Bank, because he seems to have that close relationship with John Paul II. And he knows the inner workings of why Benedict the 16th stepped down, and it had to do with the Vatican Bank, which is, again, if you know from Operation Gladio and the lectures that we've done from multiple books from multiple different political perspectives on Gladio, we can absolutely confirm that that was this OSS CIA operation. But again, who are the papal bankers since the 1800s officially on record? The Rothschilds. And this is well known. It's admitted public historical fact all the way back to 1832, and then loans all the way up into the late 1800s, and then presumably still having that close relationship, which is why it makes perfect sense that as a Rothschild representative, he would be knowing the inner workings of the Vatican Bank, because the Rothschilds have a close relationship to the Vatican Bank.
right. I mean, I don't know anything about the Vatican Bank. I'm not even going to lie. I didn't even know that there was a Vatican Bank. And I actually want to pick your brains a little bit more about this now. But guys, we are going to be reading out some super chats if they do come in. Any questions that you guys have got for Jay, if you did want to do that after this topic, we'll read them out. So get them in if you'd like. But Jay, Vatican Bank, what are we talking here? What is that?
Well, certainly all churches and religious institutions have, some form of banking accounts or something like that. So let me be very clear on what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a religious institution, getting donations or having money or something like that. I'm saying a specific unique bank that is international, that is the Vatican's bank, called the Institute for Religious Works. And so the Institute for Religious Works, by the way, has been riddled by constant scandals for many, many decades, many, many years. The most famous of which of recent times is the Roberto Calvi case, and the connection to the P2 mafia. And this is what led to the death of not just Roberto Calvi, but many people think John Paul I, and a host of other people and bankers throughout Italy. And this is in regard to what's called Operation Gladio and the Banco d'Ambrosio scandal, which was part of the Vatican Bank's network scandal. So,
Hmm.
long story short, because the Vatican Bank was an international bank, and because the Vatican, particularly at the time of the Cold War, so right after World War II, Bill Donovan, James Jesus Angleton, and William Colby, three very important CIA, OSS, and CIA figures, who were all Roman Catholic, by the way. They set up these very close relationships through working at the Rome desk in the case of Colby and Angleton with the Vatican. And so Vatican has its own secret service, its own intelligence operation, and it has its own bank. And because the communists were beginning to win elections and getting popular in the Cold War in Italy, the CIA said, "Well, we don't want that, happening in Italy." And the Vatican obviously agreed, and so there was this alliance that was made. This is all public. This isn't conspiracy theory, because the Vatican wanted help so that the Christian Democratic Party could win the elections and not the communists. So that's what forged the original connection. And those CIA operatives said, "Well, look, we're happy to do this, but we're going to need the Vatican also to be on our side when we need things from the Vatican." And that led to this relationship between people like Cord Meyer and other individuals who would become famous CIA drug traffickers. That's how they set up this relationship to have black budget money funneled through the Vatican. Why? Because the Vatican is the world's most secret bank next to the BIS, and it's not subject to Italian laws or EU laws. It's its own independent city state. So just like the Washington, D.C. is an independent city state within the United States, so likewise, the Vatican is its own independent city state. It's not subject to the Italian laws or to European laws. So, as even Epstein himself describes, which I thought that's why I honed in on that email so much, because so many of the books that we've highlighted over the years, whether it's Paul Williams or whether it's the God's Banker text, which is about Roberto Calvi and all this, all of that was really vindicated, I think, in that Epstein email description about the Vatican Bank. So this is all 100% real stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Did
So
I make? I mean, I feel like am I putting out too much? Like, am I not explaining it well? Like, am I just putting out too much names and facts? Not to you, but I'm saying, do you think for the sake of the
no,
audience, like,
I'm
is there
just.
is there
I
something I can?
think it's probably the audience probably gets it better than I do, but I do kind of get
Well,
what you're
I
saying
didn't mean
though.
that to insult you at all.
No, 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 no.
Right.
But I did say to you, I kind of want to like I get the things, but connecting the dots is the hard part sometimes, and that's why I really wanted to talk to you today because the dot connecting, like you have all of the individual stories, but it's sort of in its own little factions, and
Well,
then
let me
trying
put it
to
this way.
connect it.
So
Yeah.
the way that, according to Paul Williams's Gladio book, and he was an FBI consultant, so he's not really some sort of like wild conspiracy theory. He's a Catholic historian guy who consulted the FBI all the way back to the late 2000s on organized crime and Al Qaeda. We lectured on his book on Al Qaeda a few months ago, but he wrote a book on Operation Gladio and the Vatican Bank scandals.
Mm.
And again, there's many other books that we've covered too, but his is particularly, I think, instructive because he's a Catholic, so he's not like, coming at this from some vendetta against the Roman Catholic Church or something. And he's not a conspiracy theorist. He's just sort of looking at um, the data and information. And as Gladio became more and more public, what happened was uh, in the 1990s, they didn't know what to call it, but they knew that there were these stay behind networks that were operating throughout Europe that were originally set up by the OS and CIA in case of a Soviet NKVD invasion. So if Stalin ever moved into Europe, the purpose of Gladio supposedly was to fend off a Stalinist invasion. So, and that makes sense. Like, obviously, if I'm anti-communist, that makes sense why you would do that. And I'm not pro-Soviet at all, or pro-communist or pro-socialist. I'm just giving you the layout of why they were doing this. The problem is that it also became a network, you could say, throughout Europe for corruption and for chaos, with these people who were trained in terror cells and terror operations, but they also compromised many high-level Italian and Vatican officials. And that came out in European news in the 1990s. They didn't know that it was called Gladio yet, but this compromise list was leaked. And guess what? Same model as the type of stuff that Epstein was doing. It's just that back then with the P2 Lodge, it was more so prostitutes. There probably were some gay things going on, but they were called Boonga
Always, there
Boonga
always
parties.
is.
Yeah, yeah, you can just look up Berlusconi's. There were some scandals that came out 10 years ago about the same things going on with the Boonga Boonga parties with Berlusconi. And when Epstein even invited Berlusconi to the island, and Berlusconi made a joke, something like, the women who come to my parties actually want to come back. I don't have to enslave them. Or he says some joke like that, like, I don't have to traffic them because they actually like coming to my party. So just look up Boonga Boonga parties with Berlusconi. Berlusconi is on record as a P2 Lodge member. So he was part of the P2 Lodge, which is where they were recruiting people into Gladio. Long story short, Kissinger, according to Paul Williams, was the mastermind of how to put Licio Gelli, who was the head of the lodges, the Grand Master lodges, P2 lodges in Italy, put him in control of this operation, together with Michele Sindona, who was in charge of Italian organized crime in Italy. They worked together with the lodge and with organized crime to bring people into Gladio in case of the Soviet invasion. But what it ended up being was an entire government being compromised in the 60s and 70s by Kissinger running this operation. Now, who spots Brzezinski and who spots, apparently, according to Epstein, for Rockefeller? Kissinger circles, right? So they do the same thing with Epstein, putting him into this role. Same thing with Licio Gelli and Michele Findona in Italy, to run a big compromised government control shadow government operation. So I don't think it's accidental if you read those books.
Hmm. So, who do you think he had the closest relationship with of all of the different agencies? Because there's just so many that are named here. You've got obviously like the Vatican, you've got the various different intelligence agencies, CIA, Mossad, the MI6. You've got the guy from the Emirati businessman that he's involved with. It
Mm,
seems like he pretty much has his toes dipped in every single pond, right? He's got his fingers in every single
exactly.
pie. So, who is he most
Well,
close
I think
with,
it's
do you think?
he's definitely a high level operative and fixer for the Western elite, right?
Western elite.
So again, he's up there hanging out. We find out in the circles of Rockefeller, Kissinger, Brzezinski. He's in those circles, so he's higher up than, like you said, than we thought, and that would mean that he's really probably you know up near the top, but not at the top. So that would mean he's probably a high level operative for all of Western intelligence, because he's working with Saudis, he's working with sheikhs. Like I said at the beginning, the second day, one of those emails came out that he had planned to meet like 15 heads of state. And it's like, how are you doing all this without, approval above government? Now, what's something we always talk about on my channel is that the people at the steering committees, they're above people at the CIA. Okay. People
Right.
that run foundations, that's higher than being a CIA section chief, or some sort of operative in the field, obviously, or something like that, or handler. So this is above that. This is at the level of steering committee, Bilderberg type stuff, Davos type stuff. And you saw that one email where he was saying, we want to make Davos the new United Nations. United Nations is too fake and gay. It doesn't really get anything done. We want to put Davos in there. And he talks a lot about Davos, and that's because Davos was also a Kissinger project. Harvard research project was the brainchild of Kissinger, and they collated this idea to set up another one of these steering committees, kind of like Bilderberg, but a little more public with broader reach and scope. And that's essentially what World Economic Forum in Davos was. And
Right.
that's
So World
that's why
Economic
Klaus.
Forum, that was started like 1971, Klaus Schwab. right? He started that. It was smaller back then, but then wasn't Kissinger more involved in the Club of Rome? Wasn't he involved in that in the Club of Rome, or was he directly involved in the formation of the World Economic Forum?
He's directly involved in WEF, so it comes out
Right.
of Kissinger and Harvard Research Project. So, but no, I'm sure Kissinger has a role in Club of Rome too, because another key Rockefeller operative, Maurice Strong, was one of the key chair people of Club of Rome. So you're noticing pattern here of like obviously David Rockefeller plays a huge role, which we've said for many years. I have this biography of the Rockefeller family right there, authorized biography, and that biography just tells everything. Like they
Mm.
were behind the ecumenist movement, the Council of Churches, World Council of Churches. They were behind setting up the CFR. They played a huge role in setting up the United Nations. They donated the land for the UN. Played a huge role in setting up the OSS and CIA. So they play a huge role. They're big, massive. And one of their key recruits, also out of intelligence, is Henry Kissinger. So Kissinger had a time in intelligence as well. He's brought in to kind of be this sort of neocon operative for many years for that family. And I'm just pointing out that, like, now a lot of those things make more sense to me, that it's pointing to this sort of overarching oligarchical power structure that runs the West, not the politicians. Like the politicians have a very minuscule degree of power, but up at that level of the steering committee people, and I think you could place the Royals up there pretty high as well. They do have a lot of power. But everybody points to that picture of like Lord Rothschild's like pointing his finger in King Charles is like he's putting his finger into his chest, like you're gonna do what I say if you've seen that famous picture. So
Makes sense.
I think the Rothschilds, yeah, they've had a huge amount of power in the UK. I think the British Empire eventually became kind of a cutout for them. And if you read even Tragedy and Hope, which is not at all interested in so much of the Rothschild stuff, he admits all kinds of stuff about the Rothschilds, like the Suez Canal. That was all a Rothschild operation. Quigley basically admits that what's his name, Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Trust and all the diamond operations, that was De Beers, that was all Rothschild money too.
And the
So
Rothschilds were
I think
directly involved with the creation of the state of Israel, right? The Balfour Declaration was written
Oh,
to,
absolutely.
yeah.
And in fact, according to even before Balfour, all the way back in the 1860s, according to their family history and according to Moses Hess in his book Rome and Jerusalem, they were buying land in the 1860s.
Oh shit.
So
All the
they
way
had
back
an
then.
idea to have originally, according to Morton, he says the idea was to have just pilgrimage sites that Jews could visit. But eventually it became more and more of a political thing because the political Zionists like Chaim Weizmann and Theodor Herzl were putting pressure on the Rothschilds and saying, hey, we need to actually get into politics. It's not going to be just a religious pilgrimage site. Because in the 1860s and later on, they were just kind of buying land for Jews to do pilgrimages, and they were buying land from the Turkish sultans, right? So it
Right.
wasn't like they were just stealing the land immediately from Palestinians. They were buying it from Turkish sultans, but it was called Palestine land. And in fact, all the original Rothschild documents when they were buying, it was called Palestine land. Like that's what it was called. So this idea
Mm.
that it never existed is simply not true. Even the Rothschild, um, there's even postcards that the Rothschild sent from Palestine. So long story short, they bought more and more land, and then pressure was put on them by people like Chaim Weizmann to make it more political. And then eventually they got on board with political Zionism at the time of Balfour. But Balfour didn't actually accomplish much. And so you needed other conflicts that actually led to the real establishment of the nation state of Israel. And I think they weren't recognized until.
Right. So all of these powers that we're talking about here, this is one thing that I do wonder with obviously all of the different intelligence agencies, the Vatican, the different Arab uh, nations that are becoming more and more powerful. Is there some sort of like a common thread that unites all of those guys in the sense that
Yeah.
they all work together in international banking, or are they just factions that just sort of operate the same way but are removed from one another?
No, great question. It's the Atlanticist power bloc, or what's sometimes called the Anglo-American establishment. Now, that term is not used to castigate Anglo people. It's the older term that was used in geopolitics during the time of what's called the Great Game. So this is the battle between Russia and the West, particularly Russia versus the UK, right? So when the British Empire was very powerful, one of their main rivals was the Russian Empire. And so the term out of the Great Game for the Anglo-American establishment is just a term that was used for many, many years. So when Quigley was writing in the 1960s and he did Tragedy and Hope, he calls the Western power bloc the Atlanticist power bloc. And that's just talking about all of the land over here that's not Eurasia, right? And this has nothing to do with the good guys, bad guys. It's just laying out the geopolitical scheme in terms of what Lord Halford Mackinder called the heartland theory. So you have heartland and rimland, and the thesis of Mackinder was that any empire that wants to have dominance in the world needs to control the heartland, and that's Eurasia. So you can be a sea power, a little bitty sea power like the UK, and have a world empire if you're able to have dominance in certain areas. That same theory of heartland, rimland, and all that is pretty much the theory of Pax Americana. And you notice that Brzezinski and Kissinger, all those kind of big scale players, they write often about this. In fact, Brzezinski's books, I think in Grand Chessboard, he even has a whole layout of like heartland, rimland early on. And he says America will have to control the Eurasian heartland. In fact, years ago, he was talking about the importance of Ukraine as a geostrategic region to put pressure on Russia. I think his last book, Strategic Vision, even predicted what the U.S. would do in Ukraine. I remember reading that in grad school. I was sitting at the library research desk reading Strategic Vision, even before there was like Maidan Q. I think it was 2011. But so anyway, so yeah, so they strategized this out. But to answer your question, it is the Western powers, the Western power bloc, the Atlanticist power bloc. And no, it's not denying the influence of Israel when you cite that terminology from Quigley, because when Quigley was writing in the 1960s, it just wasn't, we weren't at the point where Israel had as much power as it does have now, right? And we see that in, for example, the JFK files. They were already beginning to have a lot of power and influence, particularly with regard to the James Jesus Angleton back channel conversations that they were having about JFK. A lot of people in the CIA didn't like JFK, so they were kind of looking for other people who didn't like JFK. Then that included mobsters, that included Israeli operatives, and it included a lot of people in the CIA and corporate people. So a lot of people didn't like JFK, and that doesn't mean JFK is like some saint or hero. I'm just giving you the facts of the matter. So after the JFK period, I think you get more and more, especially after USS Liberty, we begin to see more explicit pressure from Israel put on American foreign policy and presidents and other people that wasn't as pronounced before that.